Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, A Bird to Overhear with Brice Honeycutt. We're joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Programs at the Society, and we have a number of newcomers in our virtual audience today, so I'm going to just say a few words of introduction to the American Antiquarian Society. AAS is a national research library and archive, which is located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials that are printed or produced before 1900 in what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include newspapers and periodicals, books and pamphlets, children's literature, manuscripts, and graphic arts materials such as prints, photographs, maps, and ephemera. You will see many examples in today's presentation from the collections. AAS supports and welcomes scholars from around the country and indeed from around the world to use our reading room or to make use of our digital collections through our website. We also offer regular programming like this virtual program, and I do want to invite you to return to our website to see about upcoming programs in the coming weeks and months. Today's program is part of a series that we're calling Artists in the Archive, and it is also part of a series second series we call The Nature and the Environment. So it's kind of fun that today's program fits into two of our program series. You can go to our website for continual updates about all of our programs, including other series that we carry. And as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide for this free programming, and we thank you for any support you can provide. I'm joined this afternoon by my colleague, Amanda Condick, who will share with you a few notes in the chat about using the Zoom webinar function. And she will also let you know how you can participate in the question and answer portion of the program toward the end. She will also be posting links in the chat throughout the program. And to open the chat, you can click on the chat box icon at the bottom of your screen. We do also want to remind you that the program is being recorded, so you will have access to this later, either on our website or through our YouTube channel, and feel free to share that with others. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Brianne Barrett, who is Library and Program Assistant. She will be helping and sharing some of the materials that we're going to show you from the archive, and also by Nate Fisk, our media producer, who will be working behind the scenes to make sure everything is operating smoothly. We like, when possible in our programs, to highlight some of our local Worcester institutions. And this afternoon's program is co-sponsored by the Aquarium Museum of Science and Nature in Worcester. And I'd like to ask the Aquarium's president, Noreen Smith, to turn on her camera and to say a few words of welcome. Noreen, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nan, and thank you to the American Antiquarian Society for inviting us to co-sponsor today's presentation. We are very excited to be here. The Ecotarium is a museum of science and nature. We are the second oldest natural history museum in the country, and we have an historic ornithology collection. There's a long history of collaboration here in Worcester between the Worcester Natural History Society and the American Antiquarian Society that extends over a century. The AAS maintains the archive of our organization's records that date back to 1825. So we are just thrilled to be here and hope you all enjoy the program.
Great, thank you very much, Noreen. Glad to have you with us. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Brice Honeycutt. The Artist in the Archive series that I referenced earlier features creative artist fellows who have worked in our archive for research and inspiration during a month-long fellowship. As a director of the fellowship program here at the Society, I find it incredibly rewarding to see the kinds of projects that emerge from these creative artist fellowships and to see how they take their work to broader audiences. The AAS has offered fellowships for creative artists for over 25 years now, and the wide range of products is really quite impressive. And you can see many of these projects on our website, which marks this milestone of 25 years of creative artist fellowships. Brice Honeycutt was one of those creative artist fellows. She held a William Randolph Hearst Foundation Creative Artist Fellowship with us back in 2019. Brice is a sculptor and a mixed media artist. She makes nature-based and history-based drawings, sculptures, and installations. She holds a BA in art history from Skidmore College and an MFA in sculpture from Columbia University. Her recent artist residences, where she explored both place and history, included at Hancock Shaker Village, the Fashion Institute of Technology, and Namkeg in Western Massachusetts. And she will hold a fellowship at the Winterthur Museum and Garden and Library next year. So now I'm turning things over to Brice Honeycutt for her presentation. Brice.
Thank you, Nan and Noreen, and thanks to Amanda, Brianne, Nate, and Nick for working behind the scenes, and to all of the American Antiquarian Society and the Ecotarian Museum of Science and Nature for sponsoring this talk, and to all of you for joining us this afternoon. For an artist fellowship, one applies with a specific project in mind. First slide, please. Selecting items from the collection, I propose to examine historical texts for their plant and land-based content, seeking primary sources directly related to plant uses, and healing for natural dyeing, D-Y-E-I-N-G, and for foraging for food, specifically looking for uses of weeds, plants deemed useless. At the start of a fellowship, one gives a 5-minute talk to the entire staff about your project, for the staff knows the collection. Even though I had spent time identifying materials, in no way could I ever find all the items. In a recent presentation, AAS President Scott Casper noted that there are 4.5 million objects in the collection. So thanks to the curators and staff for helping me hone in on particular items, as well as for pulling all of those items from the shelves. And one in particular, thanks to Nan, changed my project, and we will get to that in just a bit. Why weeds? I'm drawn to the underdog, things deemed useless, yet ones that provide so many uses. Next slide, please. So now let's begin to look at a few of the items examined during my fellowship. Luckily, I began researching by reading naturalist John Burroughs' A Bunch of Herbs and Other Papers, February 1896, and was encouraged by this statement, quote, "One is tempted to say that the most human plants, after all, are weeds. But weeds have this virtue. They are not easily discouraged. They never lose heart entirely. They die game. If they could not have the best, they will take up with the poorest. If fortune is unkind to them today, they hope for better luck tomorrow. They make the most of their opportunities." Next slide, please. These are from Peter Good's 1854, The Family Flora and Materia Medica Botanica. He states, quotes, "Plants appear to have been profusely scattered over the earth as the stars in the firmament, to invite man by the attractions of curiosity and pleasure to their contemplation. They grow under our feet and seem to invite and provoke instruction and delight. Shown are skunk cabbage on the left, burdock in the middle, and dandelion on the right." With foresight, he states, quote, "This study of plants possesses one very eminent advantage. It doubles the pleasure of every walk and journey and calls forth to healthy exercise the bodily as well as the mental powers." Forest bathing, 1850 style. Next slide, please. Wildflowers of the Northeastern states, being 308 individuals common to the Northeastern United States, drawn and described from life, by Ellen Miller and Margaret Christine Whiting, published in 1895. I really enjoy that they use the term individuals, for more and more we learn about plants being sentient beings. This large format book has stunning line drawings. Whiting and Miller state that this book is not to, quote, "compete with scientific botanies, but for the simple nature lover, a floral portrait gallery. It is from this point of view, rather than the purely botanical, that the drawings have been made and the descriptions written," end of quote. They note of milkweed on the left. Though regarded as a weed, this milkweed has many attractive features. They adore the seed pod through all its manifestations. And of the beloved dandelion on the right, the seed globe of the dandelion is a favorite with children, by whom it is called a clock. And when cut off by the cruel lawnmower, these generous plants put forth fresh golden discs close to the crown within the leaves. Yes, they knew about no mow May even back then. Next slide, please. There are many ways to learn about plants, from the botanical to children's books. This is from Grandpapa Pisa's poetry book, 1847 to 53. Here we see many friends of the natural world. Fast forward to 2016, when Oxford University Press removed a flock of 111 words from their junior dictionary, and many nature-related: apricot, almonds, bluebell, cowslip, chestnut, dandelion, just on this one page, and you can see those on the right-hand side of the book. Next slide, please. Others in this poetry book are gooseberry, melon, mint, tulip, vine, walnut, and willow. So children in the mid-1850s were at least learning these important plants, trees, and fruits. And one could argue, with the removal of these words, they no longer exist. You're seeing the entire list, the 111 on the screen. One of my sub-projects was to note the appearance of removed words and to notate these in my handmade notebooks. And there are so many that I found throughout my residency, my fellowship. Next slide, please. Flora's Gala, published in 1809, a charming tale about a plant and insect party, illustrated with delightful engravings, text from Darwin's father, and scientific plant information in the form of poems. Here we see the catchfly, we know it as the Venus flytrap, shown center stage. Thanks to Laura Wasowitz, curator of children's literature, for these and other children's books that she brought to my attention during my fellowship. Next slide. Actual plants are often found interleaved into books, and when found in newly accessioned materials, these are saved. One day, Ashley Cataldo, curator of manuscripts, brought me the saved botanical collection, and it's immense. I looked at each, making a list while contemplating the whys and wherefores of saving. Just to mention a few: a large sage leaf, 2 clovers, a carnation, and an 1814 Bible inscribed Bella Carpenter. A mint leaf in Margaret Cox's The Young Lady's Companion, 1849. Many pansies in History of Kossuth, Hancock, and Winnebago counties in Iowa, 1884. Next slide. Others are more deliberate about their collecting of plant material in books and herbariums. Louise Sawyer's pocket-sized red leather book from 1825 to 9, into which she placed quotes such as, "Botany deserves our highest regard as the sources of mental improvement," as well as red autumn maple leaves, violets, and lace-like thin leaves, along with lists of plants grown by month that reads like beat poetry. Next slide. Emily Dickinson deliberately enclosed flowers in her letters, and the AS holds 4 original poems sent as letters, a practice Dickinson often did. These letters were written to a family friend, Mrs. Edward Tuckerman of Amherst, Mass, between 1879 and 1881. When I opened the folder, the letter on top was my favorite poem, and tears welled to my eyes. And better yet, a dandelion had been inserted into the letter, now seen as a shadow print. And you can see that on the right-hand slide. And this is the poem. "The dandelion's pallid tube astonishes the grass, and winter instantly becomes an infinite alas. The tube uplifts a signal bud, and then a shouting flower, the proclamation of the suns, the sepulture is o'er." And in the AS version, she adds one more line. "Vinnie told me," and you can see that at the bottom of the screen. Vinnie is Emily's sister. Next slide, please. Dickinson and her exquisite attention to nature's details can be seen in these poems. There are 2 more poems that you're looking at right now, which I had the good fortune to examine with Karen Sanchez Epler, the distinguished scholar in residence that year, also a Dickinson scholar. We noted Dickinson's appreciation of plants and birds, discussed intertwining themes, and afterwards, Karen turned to me and said, "Breece, your whole project is in these poems." She was so right. Weeds, birds, birdsong, dyes, and the environment. Let's get to that turning point when I started looking at the illustrations of the nests and eggs of birds of Ohio by Howard Jones. Next slide, please. In 1876, Genevieve Estelle Jones, Howard's sister, attended the Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia, and saw the infamous John James Audubon engravings, Birds of America, 1826 to 38. Most of these show the bird amidst flora and fauna, not the nests. Jenny thought this omission needed to be set straight. A little background on Jenny. She was born May 13, 1847 in Circleville, Ohio. Talented and intelligent, homeschooled, brilliant in science and languages, also a seamstress, a china painter, and a pianist, just to name a few of her skills. She didn't attend college like her brother Howard, but he sent a duplicate set of his textbooks to her, and he noted she far exceeded him in her studies. After an illness and a heartbreak, she decided to start her project. Her father, Dr. Nelson Jones, an amateur ornithologist, suggested she begin with the birds around her, the 130 birds of their home state of Ohio, rather than the 320 species in America. Next slide, please. It becomes a family project. Brother Howard collects the nests and eggs, Father Nelson secures the financing through subscriptions, and Jenny sets to work on the drawings with one of her friends, Eliza Schultz, using the scientific tools, calipers for measurements, magnifying glasses to hone in on details. The nests were drawn to size on lithoplates, transported to the lithographers in Cincinnati, where they were printed onto Watman's hot-pressed antiquarian paper, the same paper used by Audubon, and returned to be hand-painted with Winsor and Newton watercolors. Sadly, Jenny died of typhoid fever in 1879, but her family vowed to continue the project with her mother, Virginia stepping in to draw the nests, Howard writing the descriptions for the text of the book, Father securing subscriptions, publishing the illustrations of the nests and eggs of birds of Ohio in 1886. And I'd also like to extend thanks to the late Joy Kaiser for her research leading to her 2012 book, America's Other Audubon, bringing the story of Jenny Jones and her family to light. Let's start looking at the nests. On the left is the nest of the robin. On the right, the black-throated bunting. In Howard's description, he notes of the robin nest, the foundation consists of coarse weed stems, grasses, and mud. The superstructure is composed of weed stems, and the black-throated bunting, foundation of slender weed stems, liner of grass and roller grass, and maybe some bits of paper and string. Next slide, please. This is the Cardinals nest. Foundation superstructure composed principally of long, slender weed stems. The lining consists of slender vine of a pinkish gray, and weed fibers enter in the foundation of the superstructure. Weeds, yes. Birds use copious amounts of weeds to construct their nests. Mighty foragers are they, using what is at hand, what works best for their nest. I was besotted, awed, overwhelmed, and wanted to look at every bird book in the AS collection. Next slide, please. Here are two action shots, if you will. I spent time drawing the nests, a way to really look at these weed strands. And behind me, you'll notice there are some of my drawings. It was a way to really for me to see what was there. And the next slide. And then speaking of books, I set up a table with many books to do comparison and contrast. Books over different time periods, how they were illustrated. Next slide. One of the slides, Chester Reed, North American Birds, 1904. It was intriguing to compare the exquisiteness of the Jones book when looking at the new technology of photography. Next slide. John Garcia, an academic fellow in residence, recommended Alexander Wilson's American Ornithology, 1808 to 1814. This is pre-Audubon. Multiple breeds are shown on the same page, interacting in some manner. It's a rather compact book, in size compared to the large Audubon, even though it is 9 volumes. They're beautifully painted and really show the characteristics of each bird. After looking at 140 items in the collection, my notebooks laden with drawings and notes, I headed home. Next slide, please. Back in the studio, March 2020, we're all in lockdown. Coincidentally, birds began returning, and it seems a perfect time to think about birds' nests, how to make them, where to find them. Next slide. To jumpstart this process, I used a group of old drawings, ripping them up collaging with them to further explore shape and form. So what you're seeing on the right are some of the nests that I was constructing it with the collages. And on the left is another way that I work. I guess I just loved writing on blackboards as a kid. And so I started to write which birds use weeds. There's a text of the removed words. You can barely see it, but at the top are Emily Dickinson poems, Xerox copies, and other notes that I had taken at the AAS. Next slide, please. Luckily, I found a basket making course, and with weeding season in the garden, the stalks of various weeds became baskets, or nests, if you will. However, no bird would want to make one of my nests home. They are far better architects than I am. I started to spend time outdoors looking for nests. I spotted a female Baltimore oriole gathering dried grass, and over time found where she was constructing her nest high up in a maple tree. And I'm happy to report that another Baltimore oriole nest was constructed in the same spot this year. Next slide, please. Fast forward to May 2021. Vit Hopley and Eve Lomax from Copy Press invited me to do a project for their Becoming Fireflies series. Audio-visual essays where artists provided, if you will, readings in the time of COVID, transmitted via videos on their website. What to write about? Birds and the environment became the obvious choice. In writing the draft, not only did I rely heavily on my AS notes, but I started going through old studio journals and realized that I'd been notating birds' activities for the past years. These notes became chapter 2. Next slide. At AS, I read Thomas Nuttall's A Manual of Ornithology of the United States and Canada, 1840, and was struck by how he notated the sounds of birds. So I knew I wanted to record their songs too. On the very back wall of the studio on a pink piece of paper, I wrote out the notations that Nuttall used for talking about how birds sound. Next slide. After revisions, we divided the final work into 5 chapters: listening, observing, entanglement, silenced, overhear, which was the last chapter, each recorded with a mic attached to my phone. Very low tech in a way. On a summer morning, I woke up early to capture the vibrant, loud, and enthralling dawn chorus. Next, filming, starting with chapter 1, again using my iPhone with a special lens attached. And for continuity and flow, we built each chapter on the preceding. Videos were sent back and forth to the Isle of Wight, where Copy Press is located, for editing. After months of pleasurable collaborative work, next slide, please, A Bird to Overhear was launched in February 2022. Thanks to Vit Hopley, Eve Lomax, John O. Lomax, and Opal Morgan for all their encouragement, work, and giving me the opportunity to transform and transmit my research done at the AS into A Bird to Overhear. Now we are going to show a brief clip from next slide, please. Show a brief clip from chapter 4, Entanglement, the basis of which comes from reading the nest descriptions in the Jones family text. The painter Ellsworth Kelly, a birder from H8, recalled, "I remember vividly the first time I saw a redstart, a small black bird with a few very bright red marks. I believe my early interest in nature taught me to see, to register the darts and dashes, the flecks of color. Yet finding a bird's nest is harder to see, harder to locate. What do they build them with? Materials at hand, mighty foragers are they. Silky spider webs, thin strips of birch bark, moss pulled from the wet ground. grapevine bark torn into small strands, rootlets, dried reeds and leaves, large sticks and small twigs, straw, lichens, milkweed filaments, human hair, thistle and coltsfoot down, horsehair, cinquefoil stems, so many weeds, wasp nest paper, mud. And it is Genevieve Estelle Jones and her family's illustrations of the nests and eggs of birds of Ohio that taught me to see, to recognize those desperate parts that form a whole. Nests, these assemblages of the bits and bobs, often just plain detritus, are so well hidden that to find them, one must both look and listen. Listening. Thank you, Nate. When I first met with Nan for my orientation, she said so presently that it's often the unexpected that will end up guiding your project. And so right she was. Weeds continue to be in the center, but I wasn't expecting them to be in birds' nests. And for my research time to discover this, I am ever grateful. Now we're going to look at some of those items used in my research. The first one is Jacob Bigelow's American Medical Botany, 1817 to 1821. It's a collection of native medicinal plants, botanical chemical analysis for medicine, diet, and the arts. And this is skunk cabbage. And earlier you saw a skunk cabbage, and this one is almost abstracted in a way. This area right here is called the spadix, but it seems so abstracted you would never really know that it is that item of the plant. It took me a while as I was looking at it to realize that that's what it was. Its singular flowers, he notes, are among first which break ground after the rigors of winter, appearing in different latitudes. Thank you. And the next one is, we looked at it in the slideshow, Ellen Miller and Margaret Whiting's Wildflowers of the Northeastern United States, 1895. What I find is so interesting about this one is they really honed it down. The line drawings have a contemporary minimalist feel, not quite as spare as Ellsworth Kelly. So we're looking again at the skunk cabbage, and it looks well, not completely different because it's the same plant, but it is interpreted and feels, I don't know, more modern in a way to me. Thank you. Skunk cabbage is a great plant. Look for it in February. Gives hope. The next is Mrs. Cm Badgers Wildflowers, drawn and colored from nature, 1859. Has a lovely cover. Oh, yeah. Marta McDowell, in her book, Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, notes that Dickinson's father bought a copy of this book and inscribed it to my daughter Emily from her father Edward Dickinson, January 1st, 1859. This book consists of 22 plates of flowers accompanied by Mrs. Badger's poems. And it's, even though Emily would have been already writing, she was born in 1830, so she would have been 29, and she was already writing her poems. It's intriguing that this book came into her house and that she was seeing plants and poems juxtaposed. We're looking at violets, which is one of Emily's favorites. And if you're familiar with the iconic photograph of her, she's holding a bunch of violets. Thank you. So it seems only fitting now to look at two of the letter poems that Emily sent to her friend, Mrs. Tuckerman. And if you hadn't already guessed it, I'm quite a fan of the dandelion. And I was happy to see it represented in so many of the books. And it is one of those removed words. So here it is, the dandelion's palette tube with that beautiful shadow of a dandelion. Thank you. I read somewhere, and if anyone out there knows the exact place where I read this, that Dickinson potted up dandelions and put them in her conservatory because she loved them so much. This is one that she wrote about the bluebird. Before you thought of spring, except as a surmise, you see God's bless his suddenness, a fellow in the skies of independent hues. So she's really examining what the bird looks like. She's relating it to what people are wearing, indigo and brown. At that time, indigo, people would have been wearing clothes dyed with indigo. I was also concerned with dyes. She often sent poems back and forth to friends. She sent this same one to her friend Helen Hunt Jackson, who was a writer poet, and they volleyed poems about birds back and forth. Dickinson sent one about a hummingbird back to Helen Hunt Jackson, and we're going to examine some hummingbirds' nests through bird books with that in mind. So here's the book that changed my whole project. The illustrations of the nests and eggs of birds of Ohio. Howard Jones wrote, "The depth and beauty of a nest, therefore, seems to depend upon the materials at hand, the experiences, genius, and harry of the workers, than upon any circumstances. Each pair of birds shaping their home after their own ideas as far as possible." I know I keep talking about weeds and thinking about them, but really these are exquisite items unto themselves. And her mother, which would have most likely made this one, wasn't really an artist. And they're working on litho plates, which is very, very difficult. And they're extraordinary. You can see all the details of the weeds. This is an eastern bluebird nest. They note its nest usually placed in a cavity or a tree stump. The materials in the nest, this is Howard talking, which I examined, were blades of grass, timothy stalks, short pieces of stubble, and fine weed stems combined in various proportion. The grass is generally forming the bulk of the structure. He notes sometimes feathers from a poultry yard, wool pieces and pieces of string. So they were hand painted with Winsor and Newton watercolors, which would have been the ultimate watercolor to use at that time. And here we see two, but this is the hummingbird nest, which is this one is quite tiny. The nest would have been 1 by 1 inch, covered with lichens, some uniformly covered with these little scaly plants arranged like small shingles or tiles. The lining is composed of plant down of different kinds, probably collected from willow blossoms and from the leaves of some forest trees. Between the lining and the external covering, fine vegetable shreds and fibers. The lichen is attached by means of web, and by that he means spider web. There seems to be, reading bird books, a dispute. Was it actually spider webs or the saliva of the hummingbird? And he notes also that the nest itself owes its security to a large extent to its web attachments to the limb upon which it rests. Looks like it's on an apple tree branch, and also the tiny little eggs that you can see. The eggs illustrations are quite beautiful, but I haven't really examined them because I was thinking about weeds. And after I was reading these about the birds' nests and the use of spider webs, when I would take walks in the woods, you often, and you might notice, spider webs that are you could see them glistening in the sun. And I've yet to see, that's not true. I've seen it on a window, but I haven't seen it in the woods, a bird grabbing a bit of spider web. Now we're going to look at 2 volumes of Alexander Wilson's American Ornithology, 1808 to 1814. He was born in Scotland. He was a weaver, and some think he has been eclipsed by Audubon, but also argue that his descriptions of birds is top-notch from field observation. And really, the descriptions read like poetry. And in fact, Wilson was a published poet and sprinkles the 9 volumes with his poetry about the birds, including the Baltimore Oriole and others. And he noted, he came to America, he befriended Bartram, who was a naturalist, and Bartram encouraged him to go out and to make these books. And Wilson notes, it is intended to comprehend a description and representation every species of our birds, the disposition, to become their faithful biographer, and to delineate their various peculiarities in character, song, building, economy, etc. And the notes of every songster recognize with satisfaction the voice of an old friend and companion. So we are looking at the robin, which is the bird at the very bottom of the screen. There's also a flicker on there, which is quite beautiful too. And he notes that the robin is a well-known bird and describes both the plumage and nest building, and talks about being an early songster, just like Dickinson talked about the robins coming back in March. He notes, in March, while snow yet dapples the fields and flocks of them are dispersed about, they are, as it were, the prelude to the grand general concert that is about to burst upon us from the woods, fields, and thickets, whitened with blossoms and breathing fragrance. There are many, many books, and I know Amanda has put in the chat links that you can go to websites to look at many of the books that we are looking at. And I encourage you to look at Wilson and to even read them. He wrote beautiful poetry and prose about the birds. Next is the hummingbird. And this is a great plate also for the way he uses the page, the way he has one bird at the bottom, the hummingbirds, and one hummingbird is feeding, and the bird at the top. He describes the nest as 1 inch in diameter and as much in depth. The outward coat is formed of small pieces of a species of bluish gray lichen that vegetates on old trees and fences, thickly glued on with saliva of the bird. So he disagrees. Within this are thick matted layers of fine wings of certain flying seeds, closely laid together. And lastly, the downy substance from the great mullein and from the stalks of the common fern lines the whole. And in the poem, he notes, then through our woodbines with glittering dews, the flower-fed hummingbird his round pursues, sips with inserted tube the honeyed blooms, and chirps his gratitude as round he roams. So that book is rather large, or it's 9 volumes. It wouldn't have been able to be carried into the field, and so his book was early 1800s, and so Thomas Nuttall, who wrote a manual of ornithography of the United States and Canada, and we're showing this book. We're not going to open it because it's extremely fragile. And this is supposedly, I've read by scholars, that this was one of the first portable guides. So I don't know, it's maybe 8 inches, 8 by 4. Not to us, it wouldn't be a portable guide, but it was then. Audubon carried one that he made notations in. And Nuttall notes, talking about birds, they play around us like fairy spirits, elude approach in an element which defies our pursuit, soar out of sight in the yielding sky, journey over our heads in marshaled ranks, dart like meteors in the sunshine of summer, or seeking the solitary recesses of the forest and waters, they glide before us like beings of fancy. And the next book has a Worcester connection. It says Chester Reed's North American Bird Eggs. And he wrote this book in Worcester. And he wrote the greatest interest in this, in the introduction, the greatest interest in the study of birds centers in their home life. Chester Reed and family lived in Worcester, Mass, and were members of the Worcester Natural History Society, which is now known as the Ecotarium. So it's a nice dovetailing, so to speak. And here we see the hummingbird's nests. Eggs, like Jenny's bird's nest, were shown to scale. So he also, when he photographed, he's famous for photographing, which I showed in the slideshow, the great auk egg, and they're to size, which is kind of nice. He said hummingbirds or winged gems, and the nest built on horizontal limbs with 2 white eggs. So we see the hummingbird in situ and then the eggs close up. As I mentioned in my talk earlier slideshow, children were often given birds about nature and wildlife. And this is a tiny little book called Book of Birds, 1841 to 44. And they quote, "There are some children who are very fond of birds. They delight to hear them chirp and sing in the gardens and orchards. And the melodies of the feathered tribe in the woods are always sweet and charming. I have often admired the songs of these warblers." So in this small little book, there's information about eagles, bluebirds, which you're seeing a bluebird here, purple martin, the downy woodpecker, swallows, the Taylor bird, and the ostrich. So it's birds from nearby the neighborhood and over the world. And the bluebird is described to have a red breast. Its wings are blue as the sky. Like most birds, it leaves us in winter, but is the first that comes back in March. And Dickinson also noted in the poem, "Before you thought of spring, except as a surmise, you see, God bless his suddenness, a fellow in the skies." And she's speaking about the bluebird. Sure, we could do. Sure, that's a, I think we'll look at one more and then we can open it up for some questions if there are any. So this is Plants and Birds illustrated with colored engravings for young children by a lady, 1840. And she notes what useful thing plants are, as well as being so sweet and beautiful. How many different things you have told me of which are made of plants. She notes, as soon as children are old to make observations by themselves, they are old enough to observe and inquire into the uses of objects around them. And the sooner they are accustomed so to exercise their minds. So to hone in on that, naming and knowing are the first steps in understanding through looking and observation. Those are my words. And this harkens back to the removed words. For to name and to know, you would need to have that word in the dictionary or to have it, to read it in a book. And this is a Baltimore Oriole. Thank you, Brianne and Nan, for.
Well, thank you, Breese, for a wonderful presentation and for helping to share some of the materials from our collections from your perspective, things that were useful for you. We are going to open it up for questions. If you have any, you can put them in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. And I think while questions are coming in, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how your work in the archive informed your work in the studio. I'm thinking about the way you weave together so wonderfully so many of these materials that we've been looking at, ideas, text, images, things that you've come away with, and how that translates in the studio to the weaving that you do of nests and the many wonderful things that you create in the studio.
That's a good question, Nan. I think to me, research is a material. So when I'm here or reading, I'm trying to find that nugget or mini nuggets. And so when I had no idea that weeds, I mean, I don't know, I don't know how I didn't know that birds use weeds to make the nest, right? So that was that moment that like, that little fact that carried the project. So once you have read 140 items and you have all that information, then it's that sort of like, there's that dance of pairing the research into an object or into like the film, how to translate what you're thinking about from all your reading. And so I write a lot I make sketches. I do a lot of you could call it whiteboard writing, but a lot of drawings with text in it. And somehow after pacing around the studio, I figure out like, oh, maybe that's the way to get that idea across. Let's write about using Rachel Carson, which is in A Bird to Overhear. I talk about her, the Silent Spring, and these are some of the notes.
Yeah, I just think it'd be fun to look at some of your drawings up close, particularly when you're talking about the way you were constructing and the use of text. So incorporate that all into your drawings. It's quite wonderful.
So these were when the illustrations of the Nest and Birds of Exo, Ohio came across, I just had to start drawing, realizing that their work is, I don't know, much more beautiful than mine, but it was just a way to look at what was that nest composed of, or how it was made, put into maybe that branch of that tree, or this is a Baltimore Oriole nest hanging from that. Wilson wrote beautifully about how the Baltimore Oriole weaves fibers in to make a textile. Basically, he's writing as a weaver. He was a weaver. So that was part of the great thing of having all those books on the table at the same time, that you could look at the nest, I could read what Wilson wrote about it, and then try to figure out how to make it into an art piece. I had no idea that I would work on that video until Copy Press invited me and to do that. And I had been following the birds. It was spring, and it just seemed the natural way to go, to start writing about the birds, using a lot of the writing that I had done when I was here and the note taking.
Yeah, it's great to see how the work that you did here evolved into that video project, in addition to the other creations that you made, the drawings, but also the great nests that we saw examples of in your slideshow.
I mean, I think you have to trust, like you have to think like, okay, I will make something. I have made artwork before and it will happen again. And you just know that your research will lead you somewhere. You don't.
It's really, again, it's so fun to see what comes out of these fellowships. We do have some questions coming in. So this is one from Lauren Hughes, Lauren, Graphic Arts and VP for Collections. Lauren says, one of the aspects of your presentation revealed how artists and creative people reuse and revisit their work over time, going back to old sketches and notes. How do you keep control of your creative archive so that you can find material? That's a great question.
That's a good, Lauren, I have organized stacks of materials, and I hadn't decided to throw those out. Sometimes you make something, it might not make it to the final cut, but it still has something in it. So there's some energy. And so I had saved a group of pieces that I'd done, and those were actually made with inks that I had made from oak leaves or other plant materials. And so I didn't really want to get rid of them. And so I saved them. And I've started to do that again, to go back into pieces of paper that I've dyed, or just because they need something else. And so that didn't really answer your question, but I do keep pieces that I think could be used for something else. And you've already started it. You know, it's like it already has a life in it that you can use again.
Yeah, great. You know, you never know when you're going to use something.
I mean, sometimes you just throw things in the trash, but sometimes I do save them. Yes.
Richard Candy has a really good question about weeds.
Sure.
If weeds mean unwanted flora, is it proper to call them weeds if birds do want them?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, weeds. So weeds is something that as a culture, people put on plants, right? Like dandelion, if you didn't catch it from the talk, is one of my favorite plants. And I'm a wildflower guide in spring and for a place that has incredible wildflowers. And I always stop at the dandelion and say, like, okay, let's just talk about this plant. This plant gives food to our pollinators, right? So, and when they're first coming back in the spring. So weeds is a word that we give to plants, not necessarily a plant. Most plants, there are some that are really not great, but that's a few of them. Most plants, I think, are beneficial. And yes, you're right, Richard. Birds would not consider them weeds. They're building materials for them. They want them.
Yeah, and that I think segues nicely to a question from Ariane Larsen, who was a creative artist fellow here since you were here, and she was doing a really wonderful project on weeds, in fact.
Oh, really?
So she asks, would you be willing to talk about other contemporary artists whose work feels like accompaniment to yours, past or present? How do you frame the work you do? How do you articulate what movements your work arises from or intersects with? And someone else who also works beautifully with weeds is the painter Claire Sherman. Thanks for your interesting presentation. Yes, so I knew she would bring up weeds, so this is great.
So
thank you, Ariane.
Whose artist whose work feels like, there are some, you know, of course now names have gone out of my brain. There's one woman on Instagram called Studio Jane. I'm sorry, Jane, I cannot think of your last name. And so we've become friends thinking about work using weeds or natural dyes or what you can do with plants. And I think there are a lot, I'm in contact with a lot. I know there's a question about natural dyes up there. I work with a lot of people that you can dye with weeds, DYE, with plants. And so I think there are many out there that do that. And when we get together and we make color, that's what you're doing, is you're making color from plants. And it's magic when goldenrod is in the fall and I get together with Katrina Rodabow or Sasha Dur or Amy Default or Kathy Attori, and who are all natural dyers, and you cut up the plant, you heat it with water, and you put in a cloth, and it is vibrant, bright yellow. It is magic. And I think there's so many artists that are talking about the natural world and what you can do with it and how we need to respect it, you know, responsibly gather that goldenrod. Others are using it. It's the fall plant, food for bees and pollinators. So I think reading about the natural world a lot, I think of the respect that so many have for it too.
Yeah. Well, do you want to say more about your the natural dyes as a part of your art, just to respond a bit more to Amy's question?
So I became a natural dyer when I encountered weeds. We moved to a place that we had to weed a lot, and I thought to myself, what? These must have uses. People that have walked this land before would not throw these things out. And so that led me on a path of taking a class, a medicinal herbal class, to realizing that you could dye with them. I took a class with a woman named India Flint at Haystacks Mountain School, and foraging and eating. So natural dyes became a way of learning about plants, learning more about plants, and realizing that they make incredible color, and that it's a way to make color that is not using chemicals.
Yeah. So here's a question. I'm sorry, I just have closer so I can, my eyes are going. So Jennifer is asking, saying your talk is wonderful and insightful. She's wondering if you could speak more about the power of knowing names and how that helps us to care about nature, whether it is weeds, a category of human judgment, after all, not botany, or birds.
Yes, that's a great point, Jennifer. So I mentioned earlier that I lead wildflower tours, and once you point out to someone like, oh, that is a Dutchman's breeches, then you round the bend and there's another one, they say, oh, it's Dutchman's breeches. And so you have imparted that knowledge, and when I go on wildflower tours, I learn the same thing from other people. And I think once you know something and you name it, then it becomes a worthy item. And so if the removed words, if willow and wren and these words aren't there anymore, and you go to the dictionary and you can't find it, does it exist? And there was a book, which I do still want to do a project of, and I think it was the Exterminator's Guide to Weeds. And in the description of the weeds, used really derogatory language, which at that point was being used by our then president about people. And it was interesting to me to be reading this and thinking like, oh, the way language is used is very important. And so plants are valid items, and to be derogatory about them as well as people really needs to be taken into account. How we talk about a dandelion, it's not a bad thing. Even though it's in your lawn, leave it alone.
Yeah. And your comment makes me wonder about how your work in the archive relates to contemporary times, beyond what you've already alluded to, things that you may have encountered, or things that you were while you're processing and working on this and thinking about your end product.
Well, funnily enough, while I was here, there was an article that came out in the New York Times about birds and bird watching, and also about how we were losing many, many birds. And it mentioned that only 1 in 8 people could identify more than 20 birds. And that just stuck with me. And maybe that was in the back of my brain when I started really looking at the bird books and reading about weeds and about birds, because I'm not really maybe I'm a birder now, but they fly by us all the time. It's like a weed in a way. It's underfoot. You don't really notice that thing until you stepped on it, that 1 in 8 people can only, I don't know.
So you are not a birder, or do you consider yourself a birder now? Or have you
Well, I would, now I'm a birder, but I think there are many different ways of being a birder, right? The author Toni Morrison was an amazing birder, but didn't keep a life list. And some people, which is try to see every bird they can, and that is amazing too. But I just started. My husband gave me a set of binoculars a couple of years ago, and I came back from my fellowship. I was like, oh yeah, let's start looking at birds and seeing their characteristics, watching that Baltimore Oriole. So I think anyone can be a birder. It helps if you have binoculars, but just go outside and look and listen.
And the more you look, the more you will see.
Right.
And the more you learn, the more you realize how much more there is to learn.
Exactly. And listen, they make such incredible sounds. And this is the time of year. The dawn chorus is loud. Part of what I did for the piece for A Bird to Overhear was take my iPhone with a mic and went outside and recorded the dawn chorus. And it was,
get early for that.
You have to get up early, but it's worth it.
Here's a question wondering about during your residency, if there were some aha moments you might be able to share.
Well, I think when I realized that birds made nests out of weeds was one. And I didn't, it's funny, I knew there were Dickinson poems here. I had been to a program and we looked at one, and I thought, I wasn't I wasn't sure I wanted to, well, I was trying to keep on track, and Lauren and Nan were saying, you really need to look at those poems. They're here. And that was a really aha moment. I got to look at her handwriting, and also to realize I've read a lot of Dickinson, but how she honed in so much on nature. She was a birder. She observed so much, and that had to be an aha moment. There was almost actually a daily aha moment. But
We see that a lot in the archive. We love to see those aha moments, shouts in the library. Here's a question, thanking you for your research and contemplation of weeds, birds, and nature. Can you kindly give the audience a brief primer of sorts regarding how we might reset our daily priorities so that we can better appreciate the natural world around us?
that's a good question. I just go outside. I think you could go outside no matter where you are. If you live in country or the city, find a park and just start to look. When I go on a walk, I take a certain walk every Sunday, and I go into the woods, and then I just stop and I look around, because I just make myself like, what is there? One day there was a feather, there was a red F, there were things that I wouldn't have seen if I had just kept barreling through up the hill. And just go outside and put a piece of paper and take a pencil and just start to write things down. Just start to look or draw. Exactly. Exactly.
And look up.
Look up, look down. Yeah, exactly.
Well, Breese, thank you so much. This has been really fabulous. I think we got through most of the questions. Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, this has been great. For those of us here to be able to kind of revisit the time when you were here in the archives, because we all have very fond memories of seeing you out there. So some of those images that you showed suggest, with the variety of materials and seeing what kinds of drawings you were doing and just what's Breese working on today. So as we do with so many of our fellows. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And thank you everyone for joining us. We're very pleased that you could be with us this afternoon, and please do go to our website to look for our upcoming programs that will happen throughout the summer and into the fall. So you can keep going back to check for the updates there. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Nan, and thank you to the American Antiquarian Society. And thanks to all for attending this afternoon.